welcome to Spotlight. I'm your host, Rian Keating. We're very pleased to have with us today a poet and playwright of international renown whose works have never failed to touch the audiences who are fortunate enough to experience them. He's written several books of poetry, the latest being Let Me Tell You About Moses. His plays, including Oh Oysters and The Cockeyed Tiger, both of which starred Ellie Stone, have received rave reviews. However, he's best known in the theater world for his wonderful translations of the musical revue Jacques Brel is Alive and Well and Living in Paris. We're very delighted he could stop by and share his insight to the beauty of his work. Please welcome Eric Blau. Mr. Blau, welcome to Spotlight.
Thank you.
Your most recent show is, which it's billed as a rock collage, and it's entitled The 104 Bus.
Yes.
Now, this is something you consider a work in progress.
Yes. We've been playing with it. I've been working with a young composer. His name is Elliot Weiss. He's Juilliard educated, which didn't stop him at all from being talented. He works for a living. He has a lovely little family and has a little band that goes around and plays bar mitzvahs and things like that. But he's very, very gifted, and I was very happy to get to know him. And although his range is very wide, his love, since he is just 30 years old, is the conditioning of his musical childhood. It's rock. And we contrived this. But the 104 bus is important to people who live on the west side, because it's that great bus that comes out of Harlem, turns south on Broadway and goes over to 42nd Street, where it turns east and it winds up at the United Nations. So the bus is, if not a living symbol, certainly a General Motors symbol, and freighted therefore with meaning. We've tried to do something with that musically.
Well, you've considered it a symbol on an allegory.
Yes.
And when did you get the idea to write this?
Well, not to shock anybody, but at Fire Island, where there were no buses, the idea presented itself more or less, because one doesn't do too much thinking on vacation, or at least one tries not to. But this idea presented itself to me, and I found it very attractive. And I spoke to Elliot Weiss about it, and he wanted to do something, and we did something. And now, as you said very correctly, it's a work in progress, because we learned a great deal by presenting it at the bottom line. You never know what a work is until you do it, but as the creator doesn't anyway.
Well, one thing I was very interested when I saw it, the audiences are from 5 years old to somebody's great-grandmother. What was their reaction to it?
Well, I think it was something like this. The people under 30 liked it very much, but they were not sure what it was about. Right? The serious composers and musicians who were there liked it a great deal because they thought they knew what it was about. Then there was a large section of the audience that simply said, "What is this about?" And I appreciated all of those attitudes, because I too was trying to find out what it was about, and I think I did. So now we're doing some more. We're going to double its length, and the bottom line is going to represent it sometime this fall.
Well, that sounds terrific. One of the things you've said is that your first love is poetry.
Yes.
And when did you start writing?
Oh, that's a terrible question. I would say I was about 6 years old. My sister tells me. I have an older sister, and she tells me that I began to write when I was about 6 years old. Not write, really, but to say things. And I would say things in very brutal rhyme. And she remembers that. So I imagine that was the beginning. I began to publish professionally when I was 15 years old. That means I wrote material that adult journals found good enough to publish.
Did that surprise you? Did you find that success frightening?
Not frightening, but it was very exciting. You cannot imagine, or perhaps you can, if you can take all of those volcanic adolescent emotional formations and suddenly have someone like Richard Wright say, "That's a wonderful piece, Mr. Blau." Wow, that's the whole world. You're living in a place that's so rarefied you cannot believe it. So so writing was really a part of my life almost from the very beginning. And I enjoy it.
These poems have been translated into French not long after they had been published.
Many of them have. Many of them have, by leading French poets. Yes.
You had served in the Army in World War II.
Yes.
And how has that changed your outlook on your work?
I don't know, frankly. You know, the Army, World War II is a big, chunky experience. I spent 4 years in the Army. And it's certainly a very huge experience, and I don't know if I've digested it even until now. It's very hard to put those pieces together because a war is not something that should be done to people. And it's very, very difficult to know what happens when you go through one. And you think about it, of course, for the rest of your life. How it affected my work, I don't know. That it did affect my work, I'm sure.
Do you think it's changed your outlook on humanity?
I'm still working on that, Brian. I don't really have a set outlook on humanity. I guess if you're just a rational human being, you want to live among people and have them like you because you want to like them. And I don't know a better way to go, And I don't think I'll ever understand humanity any more than I will ever get to understand myself. But you keep working at it. It helps pass the time.
Well, it's an ongoing search. After the war, you had worked in several publishing houses, and you had written a book about the Mafia, and you consider yourself a semi-authority on the Mafia. How did this evolve?
Well, see, in two ways. I lived most of my childhood on the hallowed Lower East Side. And from the Lower East Side, you get all of those fanciful figures, great movie actors, tap dancers, authors, philosophers, musicians, and criminals. And a number of my friends who didn't become poets became criminals. And I knew them as childhood friends, and I tried to understand them as criminals. One of them subsequently became part of what is known as the Mafia. And he had spent a number of years in Sing Sing. I met him again during the war when we found ourselves in the same tent at Fort Dix being processed for the needs of the Army. And through him, I learned a great deal about the underworld that I had not known. As a matter of fact, after the war, he brought me a book that was written in Sing Sing by 3 of his friends. And it was called Underworld, Overworld, which they had first taken to Mencken, who thought it was very, very good and wanted something to happen with it, but he was very old and ill at that time. So they brought it to me, and I couldn't do anything with it except read it, which I did. But I learned a great deal about the underworld and the Mafia through this friend. Later, I was asked by a publishing company who knew something of this background, because I filed some stories at the end of World War II for a French publication called Les Lettres Françaises, which was on the American crime scene. And apparently they knew something of these stories and asked me to write a book where I collaborated with a deputy chief inspector of police. His name was Raymond V. Martin, and he had the largest detective command in New York. The book was called Revolt of the Mafia, and described the Gallo-Profaci Wars, which took place around 1960.
How was the book received?
Pretty good. The New York Times wrote an editorial on it, and Life magazine wrote 2 editorials on it. So it had a great deal of factual value, and people like Puzo and others have used it as a source book. Now I know that because Puzo came to me once and asked if I wanted to turn my book into a musical, you see. And I didn't know how to do that.
Well, I'm sure someday somebody will figure out a way to have a Mafia musical. After that, you had spent 10 years in the sports world ghostwriting autobiographies for such characters as Nicky Mantle. How did that fulfill you?
Well, not everything fulfills you, but I enjoyed that because the sporting world and professional sports is made up of very honest people. The professional athlete is a very honest man who faces his world for exactly what it is. You can't kid yourself about the fact that you can hit the ball or you can't hit the ball if you're a baseball player. You can't kid yourself or anybody else. If you're a professional fighter, if your legs are gone, you're going to know it because you're going to get hit often and hard. You'll know when you're not performing. The whole world will know. You have to do your activity in front of the entire world. And the sports fan is the most knowledgeable person you can find, unlike, let's say, people who may read poetry or go to museums and look at paintings. They may not be, in relationship to a painting or poem, nearly as knowledgeable as a sports fan. Anyway, I enjoyed that, and I did a lot of ghostwriting and other things in the sports.
At what point did you decide to take your dreams elsewhere and leave the commercial world?
When I got very, very bored, and I just decided I'd better do something else. Pretty much what you're doing. You know, why not? You know, but it turned out pretty well, and I think I've been lucky there.
Okay, it's been written that you met Ellie Stone while she was taping campaign songs for a man who was running for the Brooklyn Borough presidency, and it's obvious that she's had a great influence on your writing. What were your first impressions of her?
Well, I thought she was very cute, you know, but the guy for whom I was taping these campaign songs said, she's very abrasive. She thinks she knows everything about this. And I didn't know what he was talking about. But that's how we did meet. And I had no idea of how good a singer she was or how good a performer she was. And that happened later when I got interested in theater because of her. I was not particularly interested in theater. And when I did this review, Oh Oysters, which introduced Ellie to the stage and also had in it such other people like John Voight, you know, who would always call me sir, which I didn't understand particularly, but he did say to the cast often, he said, one day I'm going to be an important movie star. And the cast would say, oh, John. So there you are.
Did you find the transition from just regular writing to writing for the stage difficult?
Well, the only difficulties are learning how to handle new craft problems. That is, if you know how to drive a car, a truck is not going to be too strange if somebody indicates what the, how the gears work in this truck and what speeds you can make what kind of turns with this big 10-wheeler. But writing is just a name for a discipline that explores the world one knows
But one thing that Oysters introduced to theater audiences through Ellie were 2 Brel songs.
Yes.
And how were you introduced to Brel?
By Ellie. I had brought her this record because a fellow at CBS said, "You want to listen to this? This guy's very good, but nobody will ever do anything with him." And I listened to it, and I thought he was marvelous. I understood the French. I brought it to Ellie, and she listened to it, and she understood the passion and the quality of the music and the singing. And she asked me then what the songs were about, and I told her roughly. And she asked me if I could translate them. And since I did have a kind of background in French culture, I said, sure. And from Brel, I began to learn something, a great deal, about what a popular song could be. And one of my interests today is in the popular song as a serious form of saying something about something, and it's very nice. I think a song is very satisfying.
Do you think there's a real mass market for those kind of songs that are that serious?
I don't know.
One thing the media has had a hard time doing with Ellie is categorizing her in terms of she's very difficult to pinpoint.
Well, that's true, and that's her fault. She shouldn't sing the song she does, and she should be known for singing one kind of song, and then she would make out commercially. But she doesn't like to do that. She thinks that songs should fulfill her in the first place. So she sings the song she loves best. And those are, as you know, wide-ranging.
One thing she had said in an interview when the original production of Brel had opened was that, as opposed to how the songs were received in O Oysters and how they were received in Jacques Brel is Alive and Well, were very different, the critical reaction. And she thinks Bob Dylan might have a lot to do with making America more aware of what a good song is. Did you find that to be the case?
Well, that's always been Ellie's opinion on that. I know that, and I really couldn't see the connection, because the people who became Brel fans were certainly not Dylan fans. You know, the Brel, I think, will endure for a longer time than Dylan will, because what he writes, I think, is more incisive, more profound, in a psychological and emotional sense. Brel can get deep inside somebody's gut. Dylan cannot get that deep. And he also is caught in his time, I think. He's more a figure of the 60s. Brel, who began to write before Dylan, becomes more and more universal and is not caught in a particular time frame.
What was the first critical reaction of the show?
All bad. Except for the Daily News. James Davis thought it was wonderful, but everybody thought it was terrible. The New Yorker magazine reviewer at that time was Edith Oliver, who hated the show so much that she would not review it at all. She wouldn't even give it a bad review. She said, we tricked her. It was not a show. It was just a nightclub term. And now she's maintained this view since that time. We had a brief revival of it recently at the First City Cabaret. And Edith Oliver, who is now the listings editor of New Yorker, refused to even list it.
Why do you think it had a negative response at that time? Because the reviews for the recent revival were all pretty much, for the most part, very good.
Yeah. Well, there are some preconceptions about what is a theater piece by American reviewers and American scholars. I think this is what traps them all. I don't know what a theater piece is. Beckett was not particularly well received by reviewers. He makes them feel uncomfortable. Ionescu is not well received by reviewers, and often not by audiences either. But both of these guys are writing theater. There's no doubt about that in my mind. Once you build a stage and put lights on it, I think you seriously have to ask if almost anything that is put on that stage is not theater.
You had directed the film of Blau, and they're really two very different mediums. And did you find you had more success with the film because there was a lot of symbolism in it, and it really keeps the person who's watching the film on their toes?
Yes, well, there was a problem with the film, and it's called money, right? I did a film in the days when musical, I did the film only 7 years ago. At those times, a low-budget film musical would have been about $5 million. That would be a low-budget film. I brought this film in with a 40-piece orchestra for under $500,000. Now, I think that makes it, therefore, one of the most expensive home movies ever done. But it more or less, much of it worked. A good deal of it could not work. There was just no budget. We couldn't shoot it. We had to do tricks to get it into the can. As a matter of fact, I remember and I was very nervous. But when we got to the last day of the budget, the last day of the shooting, we had to complete filming in 1 day, 6 days of what had been originally budgeted. Now that's nerve-wracking. We didn't know what we had. We shot it, we didn't know what we had. And I think that the film got put together because the editor with whom I worked was very, very good. And we spent 5 months in a dark room, in an editing room, piecing that thing together. On that level, I was very pleased with what we had done. On the level of what we could have done, well, it was the first time I had a lot of respect for another $1 million, which we didn't have.
Do you prefer to work in the film idiom as opposed to theater? Do you think you have more creative freedom?
No, I think the problem with the film medium is that it's too expensive. Until the day when you can shoot film for practically nothing, like doing a videotape. Only then will film become really creative. Until then, if you have $30 million, you can do Star Wars 3, 4, why not? But what could you do if you only had $1 million? Well, you couldn't do Star Wars. Out. Couldn't do Superman. Out. So there's an absolute connection between, in film, between money and creativity. Money wins, creativity's got to lose. But it's a marvelous medium. I love film as a medium. I would love to be able to work in it. I don't see, because of the kind of thing I do, that I will ever have such an opportunity. That doesn't make me sad, because essentially I'm a writer. And as long as I have the typewriter, some blank pieces of paper, which is cheap, I will do something.
One thing that you had done for Ellie in the late 60s was put together a recording for her on the Columbia label. And to anybody who's interested, it's available in most rare record shops, and it's certainly a find. When one listens to those recordings today, it seems to be a statement about the 60s. Is that what you intended?
No, not really. But I suppose too often we are marked by our time. Those songs were done in the 60s, and it would be very strange if they didn't have something of the 60s in them. But I'd have to listen to them again anyhow. I rarely listen to things that I've done. But I'm sure you're right. They must have a feeling.
There's one
of the
song
60s.
that comes to mind, which is Mea Culpa Baby. And for me, since I was more preoccupied with learning my times tables when there were the riots in Chicago with Mayor Daley, it seems to me that it's a statement on what life was like in the 60s, the political indifference.
Yes. But it's more than that to me, because we change. You know, whenever Ellie performs that, I write new lyrics for those little political sections, because they are very small. But the main thrust of Mea Culpa Baby is how the human being becomes alienated, how it becomes almost impossible to love, in the broadest sense of that word, in our times. That's what Mea Culpa Baby means to me. And I hope it means that to others. The political part of it is always there, and certainly because it was written, incidentally, in writing that, we were doing the Brel show in Chicago, and the riots were taking place right below the window of the apartment that I was living in.
Well, Mr. Blau, it's been a pleasure, and we do appreciate your coming by today. This is Rian Keating, and you've been watching Spotlight. Our guest today has been poet-playwright Eric Blau. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can write to myself in care of Perot Productions, 640 10th Avenue, New York, 10036. Until next week, this is Rian Keating for Spotlight.